Now we will have a panel discussion on history, memory and politics in South Asia, a journey from partition to the age of anger. For this session, we have our very esteemed panel, Dr. Yasmin Saikia, Hardt-Nickachos Chair in Peace Studies, Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, Arizona State University, Dr. Sayeed Ferdous, Pro Vice-Chancellor, Bangladesh Open University, Professor, Department of Anthropology, Jahangirnagar University, Dr. Maryam Wasif Khan, Associate Professor, Mustaq Ahmed Gurmani, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Lahore University of Management Sciences, Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury, Associate Professor, School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and of course, Dr. Naveeda Khan, who will also moderate this session, Professor, Department of Anthropology, Johns Hopkins University.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Bengal Delta Conference. I want to start by thanking again the organizers of this conference. I have been enjoying it enormously, and I hope you have been too. The hospitality has been incredible. Today, I'm happy to welcome you to this extraordinary panel. It is titled History, Memory, and Politics in South Asia, a journal from partition to the age of anger. I just want to draw your attention to the image that you'll find associated with this panel. It's an extraordinary image. I've been staring at it for a long time. It's an image of a train that is probably bound for either India or for Pakistan at the time of partition, 1947. But it's one which has transposed on it a young child hanging from a stick, hanging down, looking at the scene below her. And I find this to be a very apt metaphor for our conversation today, which is us at the present, possibly the young girl, looking at this long stretch of time from 47 to our present. And the arc that has been drawn by the subtitle of this panel, A Journey from Partition to the Age of Anger, raises all kinds of questions, particularly around the phrase, the age of anger. This is the first time I've heard our era being characterized as one of anger, and so I will be very, very curious to hear what our esteemed panelists have to say about this, and also to use this phrase as a way to think about this particular moment in Bangladesh as well. I'll just, if it's okay, if you'll indulge me, read out a paragraph that the organizers have included as an introduction to the panel, because I think it sets the stage. And after that, Professor Yasmin Saikia, who is going to be providing the keynote, will step up and do so. And this will be followed by either comments in response to her presentation, or else short presentations by our other esteemed presenters. And I'll introduce them in turn. So very quickly, I'll just read this paragraph out to you. This panel will examine the historical arc from partition to the present, titled The History, Memory, and Politics in South Asia, A Journey from Partition to the Age of Anger, exploring how collective memory, unresolved identity, and economic class questions and political rhetoric have shaped South Asia's trajectory. The panel aims to interrogate the role of state and non-state actors in perpetuating or resolving identity and class conflicts, the impact of historical grievances on contemporary politics, and the possibilities for building resilient democratic institutions, as well as whether South Asia can move beyond reactive politics to embrace a vision of cooperative stability and a politics of solidarity. I think that can be seen as a provocation, and I think we have to try very hard to be able to live up to that. Okay, thank you very much. And now I welcome to the podium Professor Yasmin Saikia.
The young women and men who brought this conference together, congratulations for doing a phenomenal job. To the delegates who have come from far and near, and honored guests, it is my opportunity to thank you for including me to participate in this very dynamic and a kind of very evolving conversation that has been going on since yesterday. I came prepared to give an academic paper, but after yesterday's session, I rethought what a paper for this audience should look like. So this is really a draft of some ideas, which I'll have to improve over time, so bear with me. As I stand before you today, I'm filled with both hope and deep concern. A year ago, we witnessed something extraordinary taking place in Bangladesh, as people like me who have been studying Bangladesh for many years watched it from the US. Once again, the people of Bangladesh rose to reshape their destiny. The courage, the sacrifice, the determination of ordinary citizens revealed yet again that the spirit of this land is unbreakable. But as a historian who has spent years listening to those who lived through earlier moments of transformation, I must ask the question that haunts me: what happens next? This is not the first time Bangladesh has remade itself. In 1947, your grandparents and great-grandparents chose freedom from colonialism. In 1971, your parents fought a brutal war for liberation. In 1991, you overthrew a dictatorship, and in 2024, you rose once more to reject what had failed you. Each time was a triumph, each time was celebrated as a new dawn, but each time the dawn faded. Promises were made but not fulfilled, wounds were opened but not healed, and because the work of reckoning was not done or left unfinished, you were forced to rise again and again. This is my plea to you today. Do not let this moment slip into that same cycle. For too long, you have allowed others to define your history. The Indian narrative speaks of 1947 as partition, as if some ancient unified Akhand Bharat was dismembered by the creation of Pakistan. This is not your story, and you must stop accepting it as such. For the people of East and West Pakistan, 1947 was not partition. It was the end of colonialism, throwing off the yoke of masters who had exploited your labor, extracted your wealth, and denied you dignity. When your parents and grandparent generation chose Pakistan in 1947, they were choosing freedom from that exploitation. This matters because how you understand 1947 shapes how you understand everything that followed. If you see 1947 as a mistake, as a partition of some imagined unity, then 1971 becomes a correction of that mistake. If you see 1947 as a legitimate assertion of your rights to self-determination, then 1971 becomes something different, a correction not of 1947, but of the betrayal. Pakistan promised that the people of this new state, of this new nation state, will finally have their voices heard, their needs met, and their dignity respected, and they would all be equal citizens. Instead, you found yourself colonized again, this time not by British masters and powerful zamindars of Calcutta, but by West Pakistani elites who treated the people of East Pakistan as subjects rather than partners. They exploited your labor, extracted your resources, diminished your language, and when you protested, they sent the military to silence you. The violence of 1971 was not inevitable. It was the product of West Pakistan's failure to honor the promise that brought Pakistan into being. When the people of East Pakistan voted for Awami League in 1970, they were not voting for separation. They were voting for the fulfillment of Pakistan's founding promise. It was West Pakistan's refusal to accept this democratic verdict that made 1971 necessary. But here's what we must understand about 1971. It was not just a political liberation, it was a moral reckoning. The violence that preceded your independence was so devastating that it forced everyone, survivors, perpetrators, and witnesses, to confront a fundamental question of what it means to be human. Over 6 years of research, I have listened to testimonies from all sides of the conflict. I have heard from women whose bodies became battlefields, who were designated as Birangona, yet found that this official recognition often silenced rather than honored their individual experiences. I have sat with families who lost their children, their aged parents, and sometimes almost all the family members in the liberation war, yet whose grief remains unacknowledged because no one was willing to listen to them. I have also listened to perpetrators, Pakistani soldiers, who carried out violence that they now struggle to understand. So many of them have shared with me their pain of the loss of their humanity and the struggle to regain it. Like Muhammad, a soldier I met in Lahore, told me of this transformative experience as a human that happened as a prisoner of war in India. Waha insan bana, I became a human there. Not because his captors were so kind to him, but because he finally had to confront what he had done. He had to see his victims as people like himself. These testimonies taught me something profound. Even under conditions of extreme dehumanization, people retain the capacity for moral choices. Even perpetrators can recover their humanity. Even survivors, despite unimaginable trauma, can choose healing over hatred. But here is the crucial point. This recovery of humanity, what people call insaniyat, was not automatic. It required acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It required seeing the other as human. It required, above all, listening to the voices that the powerful try to defy and silence. And yet, what happened after 1971? Victory became its own form of silence. The stories of heroes and villains, clean narrative of history, obscured the complex moral realities that survivors actually experienced. You elevated the courage of freedom fighters, and rightly so, but struggled to acknowledge the ongoing trauma of rape survivors, the grief of families of the disappeared, the complex feelings of those who had supported Pakistan and now had to find their place in Bangladesh as stateless. This is what I call stratified silences, layered acts of forgetting that serve political projects rather than truth and healing. Every nation does it, and Bangladesh too. You celebrate liberation while struggling to acknowledge the liberation's promises have remained unfulfilled for many of your own people, particularly those in the Mufassil areas. And so the pattern repeats. The hope of 1947 gave the way for the necessity of 1971. The promise of 1971 gave way to military dictatorship and the necessity of 1991. The democracy of 1991 became increasingly autocratic, necessitating the revolt of 2024. Each time you have done and had to start all over again because of the failure to complete the work that the previous moment began. Today we see the devastating consequences of this failure to heal. In Assam, where I'm originally from, nearly 2 million Bengali-speaking Muslims, many of whose families had lived there for generations, having migrated from mostly the Mymensingh and Pabna area in the British period, have been now reduced to non-citizens through Indian National Register of Citizens, NRC, and the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019. They are called termites and Bangladeshi infiltrators from 1971. Families are being torn apart. People are dying in detention camps, and an entire community is being systematically dehumanized. This should horrify you, that not because they are your Bengali brothers and sisters, but because it reveals how the unresolved trauma of 1947 and 1971 continue to generate new forms of violence. This is what happens when societies don't heal. The trauma gets passed down, recycled, weaponized against new victims. But we cannot simply blame others for weaponizing history. We must ask, have we done the work necessary to ensure that our own unhealed traumas don't get passed down to the next generation? A year after 2024 revolution, I see troubling signs that there is a repetition of familiar patterns. There is much talk of new beginnings and little discussion how the previous beginnings failed. There are calls for national unity, but unity achieved by silencing difficult questions is not unity, it is postponement. I see the same tendencies that have been marked by previous transitions, to rush to create heroes and villains, the reluctance to acknowledge complexity, the performance of triumphant narratives for difficult truths. I see elevation of some violence and the marginalization of some voices and marginalization of others. I see the promise that this time finally will build the Bangladesh that our martyrs died for without serious reflection of why the same promise is made over and over again. If you continue this pattern, what will happen? The hope of 2024 will gradually give way to frustration. The excluded will remain excluded, the grievances will fester, and eventually a new generation will have to rise up and start again. Your children and grandchildren will have to finish the revolution, perhaps not even finish, because this generation failed to complete the work that was started. So what does the path look like ahead? I'll just give you a few, because I'm running out of time, so I'll just, in very, very short, 1 or 2 sentences, tell you something that I see. That first, create civic spaces for difficult conversation. Second, reform the history that is taught to people. Third, confront exclusionism inside your own society. Fourth, build a new economy and institution that serve not only the privileged, but also the underprivileged, particularly in rural areas. Fifth, engage your neighbors, India and Pakistan, not through hostility or dependency, but with recognition of shared vulnerability. Your freedom is tied to theirs, even if they have once denied it. Friends, you have made 2024 has already been proven by your courage. The revolution is the easy part. Breaking what is broken needs passion. Yesterday we heard about it. You can dream. Building what lasts requires patience. It requires not only the fire to tear it down, but the wisdom to lay foundations. And I learned this particularly living in the desert of Arizona. Patience. It requires guidance, most importantly, of moral conduct that dignifies the human and the human capacity to be ethical. In other words, it needs an usul. The survivors of 1971 showed us that dignity and ethics were possible even in devastation. Their examples call us now, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. The question before you is not whether you can change. You have done it repeatedly. The question is whether you can sustain change, whether you can build something so rooted in justice and insaniyat that your children will not need another revolution. The choice is yours. The time is now. The voices of 1971 are calling you to courage. I hope you will answer. Thank you.
Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Sayeed Ferdous to the podium. He was going to deliver either a paper or some comments on the keynote.
That's a wonderful morning today, and I'm very lucky that I'm sharing a panel with esteemed scholars, and young enthusiastic faces are in front of me. So I wouldn't talk much about my own thought, but I'll try to connect what Professor Saikia has said. This is very important that in 1971 and before that in 1947, we have witnessed new dawns, and then sadly, those dawns faded away. So, yes, I will return to her call again that don't let this moment waste. Don't let this moment go away from your hand. So 2024, the long July, the uprising, or some adorned it as revolution, yes. But then before that, before going to that conclusion, before going to that discussion, I would briefly present my thesis on 1947 partition that I think, as Yasmin Saikia correctly said, in academia, it has been long considered that 1947 and 1971 is antithesis to each other. And that is a very problematic approach to to understand those historical moments. If you consider the suffering of the people, if you consider the lot they had to go through, you can't really think them as antithesis. People suffered. They suffered in 1971. People suffered in 1947. The groups may be different, the ethnicity may be different, the nature may be different, the site of the happenings could be different, but people suffered, and through the suffering, often nationalist history says the rhetorical word of sacrifice and these things, like we glorify people's suffering and we try to come up with a nationalist statist narrative. So this is very important that when we talk about partition, it has been long since partition studies has been shaped from a very Indocentric approach. By Indocentric, I want to qualify the narratives of partition has been shaped and reshaped, looking at the nationhood and statehood of India. So when we say partition, we say it's the saga of loss, it's the suffering. But then there are other side of partition for Pakistan, for East Pakistan, for East Bengal. Partition was a moment for hope, aspiration. It's the beginning of a newly educated young Muslim, like the formation of the educated Muslim class in East Bengal. It was the moment of hope to rebuild a nation. Unfortunately, our dream, our ancestors' dream with partition didn't last long, but the dream was there. Scholars said that some would argue that after partition in East Bengal, it was a land of eternal Eid. Every dawn was felt like an Eid day, with the achievement of the new nationhood and new state. So this is very important that when we talk about partition as a saga of loss and suffering only, and which is true, we are not denying that, this is true. But on the other side of the story, there was hope, there was aspiration. Partition studies hardly address that hope or aspiration. It often, when we talk about Bengal partition, it often talk about the trans-border Bengaliness, which also overlook how historically the trajectories of the Bengalis in both sides of the border had become very different since ages. Scholars have those works, but partition studies, whenever they talk about Bengal partition, it's the cry for the trans-border Bengaliness is gone, and we could revive that and those things. So this is, again, I would say, ignores the other voices, the peripheral voices of partition. Partition studies start with Punjabocentrism, much more focus on the partition in the West than partition in the East. It looks little to the Bengal partition at the beginning. When it started to look into the Bengal partition, they look toward Calcutta, Shialda station, the experiences of the refugees who couldn't stay in East Bengal and had went there, so their experiences and their narrative, which is true, but partial true. So it ignores experiences in East Bengal, it ignores experiences in Assam, it ignores even experiences of Andaman, Morichapi, and those things. So this is interesting that, yes, East Bengal Muslim had to accept that their ancestors' hand had the tears and bloods of the living Hindus and the non-Muslims. But that shouldn't be the single story of partition. Partition stories talk too much about the living Hindus, but they don't talk about the Hindus or non-Muslim who had to stay, who preferred to stay, who opted to stay back in their ancestral land in East Bengal, and then following the unfolding of the historical episodes later on, they become minority. So about these Muslims who were stuck in East Bengal and later in Bangladesh, partition studies do not talk much about that. They are concerned only about the living Hindus. What happened to those people who we label as Biharis, the people from non-Bengali speaking from Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or from other parts of India who came here? They came with the hope and aspiration to build a new nation for the Muslims, and all on a sudden, within few years, they discovered that this is becoming a land of the Bengalis, and they become the outsider here, and they become the traitor in this land of the Bengalis. And since then, till recent decades, these Biharis had been going through a lot. Partition studies talk about the Biharis who stuck in East Bengal very little. Then there is this idea of porous border that talks about Narendra Modi and his regime, talks about the Muslim infiltrators are entering to India from Bangladesh. They talk about the Muslims, migrants from East Bengal to, from Bangladesh to India, but they don't talk about much about border killings. The image of this session, they don't talk about that. They don't talk about the unequal relationship India have accomplished since partition as a regional superpower, and their unequal relationship, and like when we talk about sharing the river water, partition studies don't look into that. So basically, partition studies has a very narrow focus, and that focus is very Indo-centric. Now, when I am asking to debunk that hegemonic approach in partition studies, when I am asking to debunk that Indocentrism, am I suggesting for a new nationalistic, statist approach toward partition studies from Bangladesh? Obviously, no. This should be the red flag. Very recently, particularly after 2024, I can see a renewed interest in the Bangladeshi public about partition, which was absent previously. This is crucial, but the red flag is this shouldn't lead us, this interest shouldn't lead us to yet another statist and nationalist narrative of partition. Shouldn't look, okay, Muslims of East Bengal were largely ignored, now we should post our voices there. We definitely should post our voices, but that shouldn't be our only aim. We should think that a land should have to be for all of its citizens. No one is, as Professor Irfan was saying in the preceding session, like every citizen on this land should be treated as a citizen, not as tenants. They should be treated like so. If we want to say that the secular progressive the previous regime like they used secularism as an instrument to rule, to govern, and they used this rule of like so-called progressivism. So in response to that, if we think that we were the deprived voices, now you have to listen to me, we shouldn't forget that by posting our voice, we shouldn't erase out other voices. This land should be for every religion. This land should be for every gender. This land should be for every ethnicity. And that only would help us to transcend at an activist level, at an academic level, transcend and take things. History, like every other academic practice in Bangladesh, is very nationalistic. And we should learn to go beyond that. In response to the previous approach, previous nationalist approach toward partition or 71, we should have to rethink the history in a way that should be more about people's history. When Anam Zakaria said in her book that in Bangladesh, the history of 1971 starts from the massacre of 25th March. What happened to the non-Bengalis before 25th March in Bangladesh? Bangladesh historians do not look into that. So this is important. We should embrace our differences. We should embrace that every citizen has the equal right. We shouldn't transform this another land of narrow nationalist, statist like aspiration or goal. That is the only thing, and that is how we can only allow to not the dawn to be faded away. That is the only way. If we really can make this land inclusive, then only we can say that the dawn will not be faded away from our hand. That is, I think, from my side, that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to now welcome Dr. Maryam Wasif Khan to the podium.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and thank you so much. Let me once again thank all of you, especially the organizers who were dynamic and excited and made me excited to be here. It's a wonderful event. I hope that we see many more of these, and I hope that this conference becomes a site where all of us from the region, from what was once this broad Hindustan, as my friend Manan Ahmed calls it, that Hindustan can come together in this place because it doesn't seem to find other avenues to come together in the way that it used to be. Let me start off, if you'll forgive me, I find it very difficult to move away from the textual. I'm a scholar of comparative literature, so let me start briefly by speaking about a figure who I talked about yesterday as well, Femida Riaz, the feminist poet who became Pakistani by mistake in 1948 because she was born, just happened to be born in Hyderabad, which became a Pakistani territory, and then acquired a Pakistani passport, which really changed her life and affected her in many ways. So Femida Riaz, as some of you may know, she died around, I think, almost a decade ago now, perhaps. Maybe no, not a decade ago, at least 6-7 years ago. She was Pakistan's most fiery poet. She was a feminist in no uncertain way. Her poetry is best known for exposing the tortures that a woman's body goes through as it moves through life. She was an activist. She was at the same time also a mother and a wife. And of course, all of that stands out very much in her work. The reason I was most excited to come to Dhaka was because my older work has really looked carefully at Femida Riaz's own journey to Dhaka many years ago. And the kinds of excitement and the kinds of feelings that this journey produced in this woman who has inhabited in many ways, one of the few figures in our time to really inhabit all parts of the land that was known as Hindustan prior to British colonialism. So Fehmida Riaz spent substantial time in Karachi. She lived in exile in Delhi for a very long time during the Zia-ul Haq era. And then it so happened that she came to be invited to Dhaka, and that really marks a culmination in many ways of her South Asianness, perhaps, if we can call it that. Fehmida Riaz comes to Dhaka close to the independence, to 15 years into independence, and she comes close to the Independence Day moment. And much of her memoir actually covers her shock, her doubt, and the challenges that her visit to Dhaka presents to her sense of self. So as she moves through Dhaka, as she moves through various sites where she sees, she's Dhaka University, the site where so many professors were killed by the West Pakistan Army. She reads a journal by a woman who records the disappearance of her husband. She visits the Bihari camps and sees, in fact, her own worst enemy, the dictator Zia-ul Haq, plastered there as a hero. And in many ways, what she really exposes are the fissures in our own identities, our longing to at once be one with each other, Bengalis, Punjabis, Sindhis, UPites, as well as, of course, the fissures that have created us into these modern subjects who see themselves as Pakistani, Indian, Hindu, and Bangladeshi now. But what is remarkable about Fehmida Riaz is her insistence to never be angry, is her humility to understand that the position or that the human of our part of the world is in fact multifarious, is in fact many things at the same time. And that is perhaps the direction that I would ask you in what I truly understand and sympathetically see as the age of anger. Can we somehow see ourselves at once as fissured, as many things, as people of many places, of many faiths, of many practices, and of course, as citizens of these modern nation states, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka. So Fehmida Riaz, in many ways, stands against the structures of nationalism and state-centric thinking that India and Pakistan in particular have fallen prey to in the worst of ways. It is the kind of state-centric thinking that we persist in, the nationalist thought that continues to shape our lives today, is of course in many ways marks the victory of British Orientalism and the project of British Orientalism that goes all the way back to the late 1700s. Can we produce a Muslim? What is a Muslim? Can we produce a Hindu? Who is a Hindu? What is this? Who are these people? And can we give them boundaries? Can we give them state-marked areas? Can we make them have a language that separates them from each other? And what I find incredibly hopeful about Bangladesh is that it seems to also resist all of this. Even as people are Bengali, Bangla-speaking, they seem also to not be simply that. They seem also not to be Sunni Bengali, and perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I can be corrected, but I did, thanks to Mushtaq Saab, watch an incredible documentary on the closeness that Hindus and Muslims seem to have in this country, and I hope that persists, and I hope that this revolution perhaps has brought that big fissure, closed a fissure that if it existed is not there now. But I think, and from my very brief time, from my forays into reading works from Bengali authors, what I always stand corrected on and what I always admire is this Bengaliness that seems to extend beyond the new and rigid lines of religion that have shaped and come to shape Pakistan and India in ways that we now see are causing irreversible damage in the region. But that's a kind of a preamble. What I also want to talk about a little bit to all of the young people in particular, and I've been talking to everybody and asking them strange questions that they perhaps may not have been able to answer at the get-go, is this notion of what do we see, what do we write, what are our stories about? And I asked a few young people whether, Bangladesh has TV dramas like Pakistan does. They're one of my favorite things in life. But I got very, didn't get too much, didn't get much. I just got that there's a Saas Bahu drama that people seem to not care about anymore. But I do want to talk to you all about stories. What are the stories that have been told in the many decades, not just 71, prior to 71, not just 47, prior to 47. What were the stories that have persisted? What are the novels of Bangla that you guys read? And what do these things tell you? That's really those are the essential questions that I want to leave all of you with. And I've asked all of you what you study. And there's a lot of peace and conflict studies. I know there's a lot of development studies. I still haven't met anybody who studies literature, but I hope that some of you do. So in a sense, what I want to leave you guys with as you move forward into a new moment is to also move backward, but to move backward through the stories that have been told in this region for centuries, not last century, not the last decade, not 50 years, not since 47, but really for centuries, right? Who wrote what? What did these stories tell you about the pain of a people? What did these stories tell you about how your region is changing? What did these people eat in their novels, in their dastan, in their afsana? What did women seem to complain about? And these are just things that I want you to pay attention to as you move forward, because these are the narratives that will tell you about the nuances of each other and of communities as they move forward. But I also want you to pay attention to what you see on television, because I think you are the generation, in fact, you don't even watch TV. This generation doesn't even watch TV, they just watch TikToks. So yeah, pay attention to your TikToks also. And really, I want you to think closely when you watch your TikToks, what are your TikTokers about, okay? What are their stories? And it's very easy, remember, in the age of anger, and I see this in Pakistan a lot, it's very easy for the cultural corpus to begin mimicking what it is that everyone wants. It's very easy to create a populist narrative that falls easily into religious lines. That's something we really suffer in Pakistan, where religious populism has become a part of our stories, has become a part of what everyone wants to consume. But in Bangladesh, again, I just urge you, and even if you're a TikToker yourself, I want you to think about the stories of everyone, okay? So even if there's a great TikToker here, sorry, I think that's the narrative of your generation, so I'm going to talk about it. TikTok with everyone, okay? Ask everybody their story, and try to work with these stories to build a future that encompasses difference, but also, of course, the sameness that has brought you all together. Okay, thank you so much.
I now welcome Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury to the podium. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm not a scholar of partition history at all, but I'm really honored to be speaking on this occasion. And as far as the age of anger is concerned, I'll tell you what. Yeah, this is probably a terrible age of anger, but at this point, sitting on this forum in Bangladesh, with a scholar from Pakistan, being an Indian, coming from India, I mean, I'm the most thrilled person in the world. You know? So as far as I'm concerned, the age of anger is gone. And Bangladesh makes it possible. Yeah, I had to say this. So, I think the point that Professor Saikia made is extremely important. That in the context of the partition, the real partition, which indeed is an event of such suffering, such terrible violence, we still cannot forget its fundamental point of origin in a kind of thought, in a principle. And that principle is the right to self-determination. And after all, the question of the partition arose precisely because the right to self-determination was enunciated in 1940 at a particular conference, the Lahore conference. So it was the acceptance, a kind of demand for a right to self-determination which led to the question of partition. So we cannot afford to forget the pertinence, the political pertinence and the principle of the right to self-determination. While we absolutely must do the real hard labor of documenting and remembering the exact details, which is impossible to do, and yet to attempt to get at the exact trauma of the partition. But the question of the right to self-determination is another perspective which must be remembered, not because merely the partition took place out of that demand, but because after the partition, that demand comes back and will always come back. And every time it comes back, an existing nation state will always resist it, and not just resist it simply in principle and discursively, but with its most brutal state coercive apparatus, mechanisms. And yet, the right to self-determination of a people, of peoples, keeps coming back everywhere. We know this in the history of India post-partition. So the point is that something like the partition is a real event which comes out of contingent circumstances which also produce an affirmative political principle, which is the principle that allows you to demand a political community of your own, a political subjectivity of your own, which is expressed in the form of a nation state. But paradoxically, a nation state is a limited form. So I spoke about this yesterday. Even the concept of citizenship is a limited idea, because citizens are a limitation on the people. Citizens are not at the level of the people. The people are greater, always greater. I saw a film, the BBC film on what happened in Bangladesh, and it was the most terrible sight when a student, a real human being, gets shot, and I hear in Bangla, "Guli lagse," and he falls down. And yet, I see even more people come, and more. So I remember what Machiavelli said, that the people are always more. There are always more people. They are that much more. So yes, the people are that much more than even citizens. But a nation state will always work with some idea of citizenship, and we must try and find the best, most fair, most egalitarian meaning of citizenship. That is true. But when we do it, and that's what the history of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh has shown in different ways, that when we do it, we are not able to actually really implement that kind of citizenship, that ideal citizenship, because of other kinds of things. For instance, the question of class, power in India, the question of caste is so important, so crucial, which distorts this ideal image of citizenship. So I want to briefly speak about this. The question of caste. In an area in India where caste is almost taken as if it does not exist, which is West Bengal. What is called the Bhadralok Bangla Samaj, as if caste does not exist. That is not true. And its expression in one of the greatest artists who brought the suffering of the partition through memory. to his art in the most evocative way, that is Ritwik Ghatak. Particularly his film Komal Gandhar, which actually is an allegory of the partition through two theatre groups which are fighting over, as if like an allegory, you know, like a parable, over some kind of a common land, which is obviously an allegory of the partition, which is getting divided between two theatre groups, a competition between two theatre groups. But it has a kind of bridge, which is a woman, one of the immortal characters of world cinema. Her name in Bangla is Onushua. Onushua in Sanskrit actually means without complaining, without resentment. So there is something which is the opposite of anger. The symbol of the character played by Supriya Choudhury is that she is without anger. She, without complaint, bears the suffering of the sort of partition, because she is the actress, she's playing the role of an actress who is common to both these theatre groups which are fighting each other. So she's a symbol of a kind of passage, a kind of love that must exist always between nations, between communities. So she is a kind of, through the figure of a woman, particularly a woman, someone in the morning, I think Irfan spoke about Darvesh. She's a kind of Darvesh. But in all of this, Ritwik Ghatak's film idealizes a pre-partition as if, and Professor Saikia raised this point, as if there was an ideal Bhadralok, not Bhadralok, he wouldn't use the word Bhadralok, he himself was, seen to be Abhadra because of his personal life by what I'll call Kolkata society. But he still idealized the thought of a unified Bengal. And that meant covering over the question of caste, among other divisions, but particularly that of caste in Bengal. I don't have the time to develop this, but this is something which you will see in a great artist like Ritwik Ghatak, that on the one hand, this tremendous sensitivity to the question of something like the figure of the immigrant, the figure of the Darvesh, the figure of the Sufi, the Baul, but at the cost of a certain kind of elision, a certain kind of covering over of real social divisions. And what is interesting is that the woman represents that sort of super unity, this unity beyond division. A kind of, the woman is the transcendental figure beyond partition. So there is an idealization of the woman who represents both the past and the present, where the partition is the terrible present, in where we are. So that is my extremely loving, because I'm a great lover of Ritwik Ghatak's films, but it's a loving critique of Ritwik Ghatak as an illustration of the question of partition. But it's also an internal critique of what I'll call Kolkata society. So each of these countries, I will not say anything of the corresponding Dhaka society. You will have much more to teach me about that. But there's another poet from Pakistan who I like so much, Sara Shagufta. If you read her work and read about her life, then you will see that she is a poet in the Karachi area. She's working in Karachi. So the Karachi society, dominated by a kind of elite male Karachi, a kind of male cultivated elite, which speaks of the woman, again a woman, Sara Shagufta, in these terms. Because Sara Shagufta was a free spirit. She wrote freely, but she also lived freely. One person said, there's a statement which said, she's a great poet, but she should take care of her dupatta. So these are the internal, so to speak, internal social divisions, which are not internal. They are social divisions which reflect the very fundamental question of society and people, which both pre-exist the nation state and will always remain beyond the nation state, while the nation state is only a contingent set of circumstances. Ambedkar used to call it schema. Nation states are schemas. India and Pakistan, he said, were schemas. So it is that level, I think we need a social response to the question of partition, which is not so much India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as specific social zones, like I use the term, the Karachi zone, the Kolkata zone, and probably the Dhaka zone. But I'm so happy to be in the Dhaka zone, frankly. Thank you very much.
So I just will like to thank the 4 panelists. We've had some wonderful, a wonderful keynote by Professor Saikia and 3 wonderful sets of meditations on her paper. I just have a few concluding comments, perhaps. They're not at all encompassing of the richness of what has been offered. So I would like to say that, you know, one of the things that I've heard about since my childhood, and now it would appear into many generations in the present, that, you know, our history only started in 71, and as Professor Ferdous Sayeed has also said, you know, that has meant a particular date even, that specifically. And so in this panel, what we have is a provocation to all of us to say that perhaps it is incumbent on us to reclaim partition studies from the very narrowed perspective on it as a Pakistan-India story alone, and to see what it is that Bangladesh can gain from rethinking or reorienting to that. And here I'm reminded of Akhtaruzzaman Ilyas's wonderful Khwabnama, which does that, but which does that which orients to 47 without making it into the kind of event that has been made into in partition studies. What we also get from each of these panelists is a response to the second part of this title of this panel, which is the age of anger. And to that, instead of offering a diagnosis of why we might be so angry in the present, what I see each of them as offering is a different kind of emotion or orientation to actually attend to that. So from Professor Saikia, you get that of patience. From that of Dr. Ferdous Sayeed, you get that of a certain kind of openness to difference and to otherness. From Professor Maryam Wasif Khan, you get curiosity about storytelling and an attentiveness to all the stories, to all the undercurrents, historical undercurrents that, you know, may exist even outside of the 20th century, God forbid. And then from Dr. Choudhury, what we get is what would it mean to take care of the resentment that we have? What would it mean to quiet that and to approach something in a more Nietzschean fashion of acceptance, but without it being a passive acceptance? And so I think that each of them have given us very important provocations, both with respect to our past, but also with respect to working on ourselves at the present to attend to our emotions as a way to attend to that past. Thank you very much.